Turning back the dial, celebrating WTAP's 70 years. Now, here is Phyllis Smith.
Good evening, Mid-Ohio Valley. Thank you for joining us for this special as we celebrate WTAP's Platinum Anniversary. In 1948, only 1% of American households owned a television set. Just 5 years later, in 1953, that number was up to more than 50%. In that year, more than 200 broadcast television stations signed on for the first time. On Veterans Day, November 11th, 1953, at 7:25 in the evening, WTAP joined those stations. We had a 25-minute news, weather, and sports report. The first face you saw from the WTAP studios on 7th Street here in Parkersburg was Tom Neal. Our original owners, the Frank Bear Group, were able to bring a local station here to the Mid-Ohio Valley. From there, we never looked back. Over the next half hour, we will take a look back at some of the history of WTAP. We will also talk with some of the people that have been here to serve you for more than half of those 70 years. We will also look at some of the people and news stories we here at WTAP have been able to bring to you. Our first stop tonight, the history of WTAP. We first hit the air in November of 1953. We've been covering the Mid-Ohio Valley now for 70 years. It's a milestone marked by major changes in the industry as well as the station itself. Our Laura Bowen talked to key figures of WTAP's history to better understand what made WTAP WTAP.
At 7:25 on the Wednesday of November 11th, 1953, WTAP signed on for the first time. Our first broadcast was a 25-minute broadcast of news, weather, and sports. We haven't went off air since, keeping you up to date with the latest news and how it impacts your life. Your story, of course, is a big part of ours.
Silver Bridge collapsed out in Point Pleasant in 1967. Cooling towers at Willow Island collapsed in 1978, I think that was.
Personally, I covered the Shell chemical explosion, the IEI plastics fire.
Glenn Wilson, longtime newscaster here, covered the presidential campaign of John F. Kennedy when he was in Parkersburg in 1960. And there's a great picture of him greeting JFK at the library at the airport.
WTAP first hit the airwaves from our studio on 7th Street here in Parkersburg. You've seen some of the biggest stories in the country's history right here on this station. The stories we share nowadays look a lot different on screen than they did when the station first aired.
Well, of course, when WTAP would do its newscasts in the olden days, I guess in the 50s and the 60s, there were huge studio cameras, and of course they were just black and white.
Even our anchor's eye contact has changed.
In the early days, there were no teleprompters at WTAP. You had your copy on the table in front of you, and you looked down and you read it, and you tried to have some eye contact with the viewers at the same time.
WTAP moved to its current location in August of 1990 here at the end of Market Street. The move included state-of-the-art broadcast equipment for the time. We've continuously modernized our technology through the decades, which has brought on multiple changes. For instance, viewers now have more access to our news. The technological shifts from analog to digital meant more subchannels. Think Pinpoint Weather, MeTV, and our show on Fox.
All these stations in Parkersburg, when there was once only one, meant a lot of choices for people who don't have cable or satellite or streaming or whatever and just get television off an antenna.
The TV isn't the only way to get updated on WTAP's latest news anymore, nor do you have to wait for our show. With the onset of the internet, TV news isn't just TV news. WTAP got its website in the late 90s.
You worked on a story, or maybe two, during the day, and the aim was for the 6 o'clock news. Of course, now if you've got a breaking story, an ongoing story throughout the day, you're constantly posting information to the web.
It wasn't always possible to get a picture of a fire out 30 minutes after it started. In the beginning, there was film.
In order to get the film developed, we had to drive it to Coolville to a photo processing plant there, and you had to get it by 1 o'clock in order to get it back in time for the 6 o'clock news.
And after that, videotape.
When we had a fire that happened at 11 o'clock in the morning and we had a noon newscast, we go out and shoot the fire, rush it back to the station, and put it on what we refer to as raw, meaning unedited, for noontime, and hope to the world that nobody shouted any profanity or there wasn't something weird that happened that shouldn't go on the air.
Videotape, through its multiple evolutions, didn't come without its challenges.
The tape was about 20 minutes long, 15 or 20 minutes. And that was fun when we were shooting some kind of a trial in court. We constantly have to change the tape every 20 minutes, which would get the people in court all riled up because I had to open up the tape recorder, put a new tape in, and I'm not always the quietest person in the world, as you can probably tell.
Now, I don't know if our viewers may have seen the movie Broadcast News, where the producer grabs the tape, screaming, out of my way, running down the hall, and tosses it to the tape operator, and he puts it in and has it set just as the anchor is introing the story. And a lot of moments like that for our reporters and our anchors waiting, going, I hope this story's ready.
WTAP's earlier equipment was also heavier and more to carry. For sports, this meant reporters were up in the press box, stationary.
When they got camcorders, you could go down on the field. They were lighter. You could go down on the field, and you get great dramatic shots, the immediacy of being up close to the action, and having the football players come right at you and into the end zone.
WTAP Sports has gone through a huge evolution since its start. Football Frenzy wasn't a show until the fall of 2000.
Mid-Ohio Valley is a big football area, and I thought it would be great to give the fans of all the teams could be able to watch their team's highlights on a Friday night.
And day-up post-game highlights are a luxury of the modern day.
You had a restaurant menu board, black, and you'd get these white letters and numbers, and you would stick the name in, like PHS, Marietta, and then you put the score over there, and you'd have a camera guy shooting that, and the director would superimpose the score over the slide of a football.
From sports to breaking news coverage, telling the story of the Mid-Ohio Valley has been a privilege for the many people that have walked through this station's doors. Thank you for letting us into your homes and hearts. We look forward to our next 70 years together. Laura Bowen, WTAP News. This is home.
WTAP went on the air for the first time from our location here at the end of Market Street in August 1990. Tom Neal was the first person people saw on WTAP when we went on the air in 1953. But it's Glenn Wilson that many people still associate with the station. Our Chase Campbell took a look at the impact that Glenn had in his more than 4 decades here at WTAP.
For the better part of 4 decades, Glenn Wilson was the face of WTAP for many people in the Mid-Ohio Valley.
Maybe, and some people might call it a living logo of the station. And that's not only how I thought of Glenn during those years, but how a lot of people thought of him.
Wilson started his career in radio, but moved over to television at WTAP in 1958.
They were looking for a news director here at WTAP TV, and I auditioned for the job and got it. I thought this is the way of the future.
Over the course of his years at the station, Wilson wore a lot of hats.
He did it all. He started out on radio, then he transitioned over to television at WTAP, hosted children's shows. He did the weather. He was the news director for several years on and off. And so he'd seen it all and done it all.
In his work in news, Wilson covered some of the most earth-shattering stories in the region's history.
He was part of some of the biggest stories of the last century in the Mid-Ohio Valley. He reported on the Silver Bridge collapse down in Point Pleasant.
The Silver Bridge collapse, and he always talked about how it was so cold at the Silver Bridge collapse that his feet actually stuck to the steel beams, and he had to get people to get him unstuck from the steel.
The Harmer nursing home fire in Marietta.
The Marshall airplane disaster.
Wilson was also a window for the Mid-Ohio Valley to the rest of the world, rubbing shoulders with some figures of national importance.
And he shared with me in detail his having met and interviewed Kennedy when he was running for president in the West Virginia primary, which has always been a historic thing for the state of West Virginia.
This is my favorite photo, my favorite memory that he had. It shows him coming to the Wood County Airport. My understanding is this was when JFK was running for presidency, and he came to the Wood County Airport. My dad was able to meet him and shake hands with him, which I think was an awesome picture.
Whether covering breaking news or the daily weather forecast, Wilson was a part of the public consciousness in the Mid-Ohio Valley for decades. This earned him some local celebrity.
Glenn was a rock star, to use a phrase, in the community. We would go out to Shoney's or a local restaurant to get a cup of coffee in the afternoon, and we'd constantly be interrupted by people coming up to the table and wanting to speak to Glenn, asking what the forecast was or something about the news.
For me as a kid, like going to Kroger store with him was absolute torture, because you might just plan on being there for 2 hours because everybody recognized him, mostly as the weatherman, and then they would be like, "Hey, Glenn, what's the weather going to be?"
The people who knew Wilson say he always responded to these public interactions with good humor and kindness.
He never knew a stranger. Didn't matter who you were, from what walk of life you came from, he would stop and talk to you and stop as long as you wanted to talk.
He was very patient. He greeted everybody like they were a friend. And that was something that I took away from that you have a responsibility when you're in the public eye to be a representative of the station and put the station and yourself in a positive light.
Behind the scenes at WTAP, Wilson was an inspiration and a mentor for much of the next generation at WTAP that followed him.
He could be a great storyteller, and he told me a lot of other things about things that happened in the Mid-Ohio Valley going back to his time as a newsman, which I guess did influence me in some ways toward the history of this area.
I think Glenn served as a mentor to a lot of people that came along and came through the station. If you ever need any advice about a career or a job or about the community, Glenn was there to give it to you. And he had a wealth of knowledge, and he was happy to share it.
While Wilson was deeply committed to his work, he didn't let it completely consume him or get in the way of equally important commitments in his life.
He was a wonderful dad. He loved his kids and his grandkids. He was very, very involved with them.
The people who knew Wilson made sure his work and influence in the Mid-Ohio Valley was appreciated, both during his life and after.
Roger Shepard and I worked together when my dad passed. I have to give him a lot of credit there, to help us get the Glenn Wilson Scholarship started, and just to continue that tradition, to help people in high school get their career started.
During the 2000s, I was on the board of the Associated Press in Ohio. During my time on the board, they established a Hall of Fame of mainly Ohio broadcasters. And one of the things I thought of myself wanting to have as a goal to get Glenn Wilson in that Hall of Fame. That became a reality in 2008. I was glad to be able to do that.
More than 2 decades after Glenn Wilson passed away, his influence and presence remains at WTAP.
Glenn did it all, and he set an example and a path of how to do yourself and how to conduct yourself and how to serve the public. And 70 years at WTAP, Glenn Wilson helped make that happen.
In Parkersburg, West Virginia, Chase Campbell, WTAP News.
Glenn worked at radio station WPAR before coming to WTAP. There have been many changes during WTAP's 70 years in the Mid-Ohio Valley. Some things, however, have managed to stay the same. We sat down to talk with some of the longest serving employees of WTAP who have been here for most of our 70 years.
Many changes have happened both in and out of the newsroom over WTAP's 70 years. However, there are some constants in those changes. In order of least to the greatest number of years, Todd Boucher, Kevin Buskirk, Jeff Nutter, and Jim Wharton are some of the longest-serving employees that have been here for most of our 70 years. Beginning in the newsroom, Todd Boucher came to WTAP in September of 1980 and worked for a total of 41 years, both on air and in the newsroom.
It was a constant learning process because technology in TV hadn't changed a whole lot by the time I got here. It had been mainly maybe black and white to color television. It's gone through all kinds of changes, as I said, since then. So it was a big learning process for me, not only applying what I learned, say, in college, but just having to learn new things.
Kevin Buskirk first came to WTAP in August of 1982 and is currently in his 41st year working at the station. Currently the chief engineer at WTAP, Buskirk directed the news and was a production assistant for the first 10 years of his time here until he eventually moved into the engineering department under the direction of Gene Monday. Maintaining the technology that keeps the station running smoothly is one of the many duties that Buskirk has had. However, the way that these duties have been implemented have changed slightly as technology has advanced.
We started out as an analog back in the day, and it was a 480 lines of resolution analog with an analog transmitter. And some people that are old enough will remember the ghosting of the transmitter signal. And we moved totally from analog to digital, and we're doing multiple stations in one transmitter where that would never have been possible with analog. We've also changed from having the signals for NBC, CBS, Fox being delivered by microwave hops across the country to being delivered by satellite, and now we're even moving more towards internet delivery of signals.
Jeff Nutter began his time at WTAP in January of 1981 and has been here for 42 years. Nutter is currently the Director of Creative Services. However, much like the others, he has held many roles throughout the years. He was a production assistant, newscast director, and even spent a period of time as the only photographer at the station until another person was hired to strictly deal with news, while Nutter stayed in the commercial sector, where he has been ever since.
When I first started, we were shooting on 3/4-inch videotape, and over the years that formats have changed. We've shot on DVC Pro, and then we went to digital format. I've worked in all aspects from shooting and editing. We used to edit our commercials, sit and cut tape together. You sit at an edit bay and you just basically edit back and forth between two machines, and eventually we improved to where we could do our editing through our same switcher that the newscasts were being put on in that point in time. When we moved into this new building, we were able to upgrade.
Jim Wharton came to WTAP in 1976 and worked here for a total of 45 years. Starting off in production, where he ran the camera and learned other positions in the control room, how to do audio, and how to thread the film and videotape machines. His position eventually led him into directing and being a production manager before leading him into sports. In regards to some of the changes Wharton has noticed since his beginnings at WTAP, he says that the station has come very far from the days where we were broadcast in black and white with little to no film stories.
When I started, the news department was 3 people, and now it's grown exponentially, and we had newscasts just 6 and 11, 5 days a week, and now we've got newscasts in the morning, a couple hours in the morning, at noon, at 5, 6, 10, and 11. So the station has fulfilled its obligation as a service and a public service to the community.
Celebrating our 70 years, LV Hissam for WTAP News. This is home.
Jeff Nutter said that one of his memories involved filming former President Ronald Reagan during his visit to Parkersburg. Speaking of historical events, a lot has happened in the time that WTAP has been on the air. I took a look back at some of the biggest stories in the Mid-Ohio Valley in honor of WTAP being on the air for 70 years. One of the biggest stories to first air on WTAP was the Silver Bridge collapse on December 15, 1967. 46 people died when the bridge that connected Point Pleasant and Gallipolis collapsed during rush hour traffic. Several presidential candidates have visited the Mid-Ohio Valley over the years, including John F. Kennedy in May 1960 and Ronald Reagan in the 1980s.
And I want you to know that George Bush and I not only believe West Virginia is worth visiting and worth listening to, We believe West Virginia is worth fighting for.
Parkersburg High School was the only high school in the city until Parkersburg South High School was founded in 1967. This started a rivalry between the two schools that continues to be one of the largest and most famous in West Virginia. The winters of 1977 and 1978 brought bitter winds and cold. Some gusts in 1978 were as strong as hurricane winds. Snow drifts were as high as 12 feet in some parts of Ohio. Several people died in the storm, which lasted for 2 days. A disaster would strike in 1978 at Willow Island in Pleasants County. On April 27, 1978, the second cooling tower under construction for the Pleasants Power Station collapsed. 51 men working on the tower were killed.
The whole community was touched one way or the other. This is a small community, so you're going to be related, you're going to have friends and family or whatever, so you're going to be affected some way or the other.
In some lighter news, the Grand Central Mall came to the area in 1972. It is the only enclosed mall within 35 miles of the region and brought more economic development to the area. Parkersburg Homecoming started in 1983. Almost 80,000 people came to Point Park in downtown Parkersburg for the first year of the festival. Nancy Hollister became Marietta's first female mayor in 1984 and Ohio's first female lieutenant governor 11 years later. The Williamstown Bridge was imploded in a controlled demolition on February 24, 1988. A new bridge opened in its place in 1992. The Dills Center in downtown Parkersburg closed in 1988.
It's a very sad thing. Parkersburg, it's a great loss to Parkersburg.
The building was bought in 2019, but ultimately closed again 3 years later in August 2022. The Shell chemical explosion happened in Belpre on May 27, 1994.
Fire department crews are still spraying water on the site where the accident took place at about 6:30 this morning. Now, one thing we want to tell you is that's just as a precautionary measure. It's to try to avoid any kind of hot spots.
It happened on a Friday with the Memorial Day weekend ahead. 3 workers were killed. John Benet Ramsey's mother, Patsy Paul Ramsey, was thrown into the national spotlight after her daughter was murdered in 1996. Patsy was from Parkersburg and, like her daughter, was a beauty queen. In the summer of 1999, Rob Bilott filed the first ever lawsuit for damages resulting from the class of chemicals DuPont's plant in Parkersburg was producing to make Teflon. Pressure from the Environmental Protection Agency forced DuPont and other companies to phase out PFOA, and they agreed not to use it after 2015. The Mid-Ohio Valley lost one of its own during the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. Mary Lou Haig, a Parkersburg High School graduate, lost her life in the Twin Towers. Her mother spoke at a remembrance ceremony at Parkersburg High School on the 10th anniversary of the attack.
September 11th was a day of life-altering loss that changed our society forever. We need to be thankful for our freedom, because we know it is not free. Let's make each day special and not take for granted that we live in the greatest country in the world.
Wirt County native Jessica Lynch was rescued as a prisoner of war during the Iraq War on April 1st, 2003.
You're doing wonderful, okay? Welcome back. Just like I told you, okay? We're on a plane now, and we're going to go to Kuwait, okay?
Hurricane Ivan in September 2004 created widespread damage in Marietta. The rain brought some areas in the region up to 5 inches of rain in 48 hours. The Blennerhassett Island Bridge opened to traffic on June 13, 2008. The bridge goes over the Ohio River and was the last Corridor D project. A derecho hit the Mid-Ohio Valley on June 29, 2012. The storm arrived suddenly and with little warning.
Traffic lights down, trees down. What a sight.
Yeah, it actually looked like something you'd see out of a movie. It didn't even look like this city at all.
Some people lost power for up to 2 weeks. St. Joseph's Hospital on Murdoch Avenue in Parkersburg closed in November 2014 after being in the area for over 100 years. The IEI Plastics Recycling Warehouse, which used to be the site of the old Ames plant, caught on fire in the early morning hours of October 21st, 2017. Over 30 different fire departments worked for over a week to put the fire out. Gretchen Fleming, a young woman from Vienna, was last seen on Saturday, December 3rd, 2022, at the former My Way Lounge in downtown Parkersburg. A new owner took over the Pleasants Power Station in August 2023. Pleasants County Commission President Jay Powell said it was a great thing for the county and the state.
It's obviously the jobs are going to continue and maybe even increase by 10 to 15%. Also, the coal industry, we continue to get to utilize it, and it'll certainly thrive with their new technology. And the fact that it's going to be green and carbon emission free is a win-win.
You can watch an extended version of this story on WTAP.com. As we look back at WTAP's 70-year history, some viewers may remember the Big Red Jubilee. It was an hour-long program back in the 1960s. It featured different musical acts. I talked to some of the people involved with the show for this story.
If you talk to somebody that's up in years, you know, most still do remember the Big Red Jubilee.
That was Chuck Lips. His uncle, Carl Lips, was the general manager of Big Red Markets. Carl loved country music and had the idea of Big Red Markets sponsoring the Big Red Jubilee.
You know, he was a very smart businessman, and you know, knew how to put things together and organize things, and you know, and plan for the program. And I'm sure that he probably put a lot of thought into that before it started. But like I said, it took off once they got it on the air.
Chuck was just a young boy at the time. The program started in 1963 and was in black and white.
I can remember, you know, my mom tell me, "Hey, your Uncle Carl is going to be on TV. He's got his own TV show now." And I remember we lived in Belpre and had to go out and turn that antenna, you know, to get the WTAP signal. But I know you could go in, you know, it was very limited because, you know, I remember some of my family going to the studio, the old studio, and watching the show live. And my uncle would always, at one point in the show, he would say, "Hey, I've got some of my family in the audience," and he'd put the camera on everybody.
Different country music singers and bands played on the show from 7 to 8 p.m. on Thursday nights.
I remember there was a lot of local musicians. I remember a guy by the name of Junior Norman, Mark Burnfield. He just passed away recently. My Uncle Charlie King had a band together. He lived in Belpre, and he was on the show. But probably the most prevalent person that was ever on there was Connie Smith.
Larry Roberts worked in WTAP radio and was recruited to be the announcer and did the commercials.
I'll give you a little idea of what we did. She would do 2 or 3 songs, and we'll be back right after this. And then I would come up and say, "Hey, we'll be back to Connie in just a minute, but right now we want to tell you about some of the things at Big Red Market. Country Time Lemonade on sale, blah, blah, blah." Okay, that's it. Back to Connie, and then there you go.
Connie Smith was the headliner of the show. She was in her early 20s at the time. The Big Red Jubilee helped launch her country music career.
She was talented. I mean, you know, to find raw talent like that and to be able to do it live on TV and the following that she had, you know. Country fans were, I don't know about today, but back then they were literally one of the most loyal fans for artists, you know. They would wouldn't listen to you. And I see people today writing on Facebook about that Big Red Jubilee show.
She later made her way to Nashville and became a country music star with a #1 song. She performs at the Grand Ole Opry.
Well, she said in an interview somewhere before it ever happened, she says, I'm going to sing at the Grand Ole Opry. She predicted that, so, and that was the one thing that she wanted to do. But, you know, with talent like that, I mean, it's just, and it was so warm. It just came through so warm on the air. It's just, she was a sweetheart, you know. And with talent like that, it's just bound to happen.
I talked to Connie Smith on the phone. She said she enjoyed the show and that she had a great time with everyone involved. Thank you for joining us for this look back at 70 years of WTAP covering the Mid-Ohio Valley. Thank you for allowing us to make this your home for news and watching us every day. Here's to another 70 years, Mid-Ohio Valley.
You've been watching Turning Back the Dial, celebrating WTAP's 70 years. This has been a presentation of WTAP TV and Gray Television.